Hello, my name is Mike Decker, and I am the Executive Director of the Rocky Mountain Consortium for Sport Research. Today, I'll be presenting on the regional interdependence, a model of musculoskeletal dysfunction. This is the third meeting, a presentation of the We Dig movement, and if you're first timer to this meeting, We Dig movement is basically we discuss and invest in girl and guys movement. One of the potential concepts that we've been kind of mulling around was really about how neuromuscular issues also contribute to how we control or influence the recovery of neuromuscular issues. For example, we were discussing how the posterior chain was always kind of a weak link for ACL injuries or knee injuries in particular. And then we also discussed some ways of how we could address it in the previous couple of meetings. So I thought the very first step we should do was take one step back and say, well, who is this movement group that we were talking about, that We Dig movement? And really what we're trying to do is trying to get to the core of how issues are related to movement and how movement can actually be the mediator for how we can show improvements in safety and performance. And a lot of times we think about how movement professionals are involved. And this is where my stance has always been, the more people who are involved with movement, all sorts of movement, the better it is that we can invest and discuss some really good solutions for movement issues. So from that perspective, we really are a consortium of professionals, and professional doesn't mean we have to have 2 or 3 degrees. It has to mean that we have some expertise in some dimension. Athletic trainers are obviously some clinical expertise, and look on the right of the list there. But if we go all the way down to the bottom, we're also talking about the patients. We can also include parents. We also can include fans. These are the people that watch a particular sport or watch a particular individual and has some specific expertise of which they can bring to the table. So, for example, in my world, the scientific world of investigating, what we're really good about understanding and measuring is the biomechanics of motion. And a lot of times that understanding stops with, yep, we measured it, high five, let's move on to the next step. But really now we should be able to pass that on to the coach or pass that on to the medical professionals such as orthopedic surgeon or an athletic trainer and say, here's where we found an issue. How can we now develop a plan to address this issue at every level of an individual's athlete or patient recovery or prevention of an injury? So what we really want to do, let's go back to this concept of we want to investigate, identify, and basically improve and talk about movement. So when we talk about movement, let's make sure we're also speaking the same language. A lot of research that I've been working on has been to do with the skiing world, alpine skiing. And the first step I had to overcome was really how they talk about movement. They don't necessarily say flexion, extension, abduction, adduction. They really discuss with regards to inclination, body inclination, which is a combination of the entire body and how it moves around a flag or around a turn. So let's just make sure that we're talking about the same thing. So in essence, we can think about motion as what happens at a joint, and movement is really the collection of all the joints moving to help us translate from one position to the next. So let's just remember that when we talk about movement, we're really talking about the whole body. We're not just talking about a particular joint or a motion of a joint. Gray and Cook has I think a pretty interesting impact on the movement world. And that is with regards to how joints are influenced with regards to the mobility, in terms of how much range of motion that particular joint is designed to have, as well as stability with regards to how the sensory system and the central nervous system is able to control or motor control the joint, have control of the joint movement. So basically the stability of the joint by the neuromuscular concepts, where now we control how much range of motion it is, as well as going through that range of motion, as well as the mobility of which that range of motion is actually utilized. Now, what's interesting, what they propose, is Gray and Cook propose, is that there's an alternation of the body's preference for whether it prefers a mobility or more of a stability at a particular joint. So if we started from the ground up, going from the ankle, it seems to have a mobility, more mobility type of emphasis, stability at the knee, mobility at the hip, all the way on up to the shoulder. So there's actually this need for not only the structure and function of the joint itself, but really what do we put on the body, or how do we influence the function of that joint during our exercises or during our recovery or training process. So we have to keep those in mind as we move forward with our discussions in movement. A lot of those times we'll see as movement professionals, whether we're a parent or whether we're a scientist or whether we're a clinical professional, as some alteration in either the mobility or stability of a joint. And each one of these issues kind of carry its own consequences that we can visually see in some cases, and also have to treat or address in some other cases. And in particular, what I think is very interesting is really this concept of a stability change that I'm interested in, because mobility, I think, there's a lot of concepts with regards to potentially, let's say, the hip flexors, because in our new world of sitting all the time and being on Zoom meetings, that they can actually adapt and shorten and therefore change how much mobility you would have at your hip range of motion. But I think what really is appealing to my repertoire of interests, we'll call it, is that the stability concept. Because as soon as you have a change in the stability of a joint, whether it's a small change in a ligament issue, ACL is actually a pretty good one here, or some other type of concept where we're now unable to control the motion of that joint as well as we would normally or would want to control it. We have now changes in how the alignment of that joint occurs, the balance of the overall body, but also the balance in between the muscles, whether it be the antagonist and the agonist, and the coordination that transpires from that muscular imbalance. So we have some really interesting issues that really stem from either more emphasis or a change in mobility or a change in stability. Now, in my world, we'll call it, that the biomechanical deficits of an individual having a particular movement issue or motion issue at a joint carry some characteristic changes throughout the entire body. For example, I took the image from an article from Crossley et al. And if you notice from A, B, C, and D, we have a young lady doing four types of, a step down in four different ways. A being the normal way. B, we're seeing a trunk inclination off to the side of the ipsilateral side of how the knee lowers the body down. We have a pelvic obliquity on C. So if you can see my cursor, we kind of have this pelvis rotating down away from the contralateral side, down away from the support from the foot lower knee down. And the last one in which we are all interested in, and at some point or another, is how this valgus is influencing the motion as well. Now, what's interesting, and I remember way back in the old days, I saw some pretty good battles about what is valgus, for example. And someone was arguing valgus is a combination of motions, which I believe as well. And some other people were arguing that, no, it's the lower leg here, the tibia rotating, and that's what's causing some potential risk factors associated with knee injuries. But really, as we can see, we can move way beyond just the knee itself or the combination of the things that are happening at the knee itself. And we can think about it in terms of this kinetic chain. Now, this is one of my favorite pictures. And even though it's only static, right, so it's not moving in this case, it actually has an interesting diagram of which we see the core kinetic chain at the middle and the lower and upper kinetic chain above and below the core. are basically influenced by how the joint above and below function. So if we start from the bottom, right, we start from the ankle. So we have basically a pronation happening at the ankle. We also see an internal rotation of the tibia, and that knee moves medially. And then we also notice that there's a valgus associated with it. But along with this internal femoral rotation, it actually causes the pelvis to rotate forward, and potentially as well as drop down, because now this functionally changes the length of the functional leg length during these type of motions. So all the while these things are happening, we also want to think about how just the control of how we organize all of our movements to really keep this stable field of view. So all these things are happening down here, but if one thing happens at this location of the ankle and it goes all the way up to the trunk, for example, we still want to change or compensate for how the body becomes level, and that stable field of view still is retained. So when we think about how these issues occur, we can think about them coming from the ground up, but also we can think about them as coming from a core, the area, and coming down or up. So in essence, we have ascending issues and descending issues that can occur. And it doesn't necessarily have to start at the foot and doesn't necessarily have to start at the pelvis, because once something does happen with regards to some neuromuscular concept or change in neuromuscular function, is that we are going to now have changes throughout the entire body. All right, so here's a good example. So that the last one where I showed, here's how the pelvis will rotate down and basically tilt or be obliquity to the contralateral side during let's say a step down. Well, if that pelvis changes, and let's say it now is positioned in a way that has a shortened muscle of the hip flexors, for the example of sitting at the desk too long, we're going to see some changes in how the muscles are actually able to function given this new change in position of the pelvis. So here's a really good example that I really enjoy, we'll say. But I basically took this from Newman et al., where this is the side view of the hip. So here's basically the femur itself, right? And all of these lines represent muscles or lines of action of how muscles function. And notice that we have the muscles that are in front of the hip joint. So these are all the muscles that will actually flex the hip. And all the muscles behind it will extend the hip. But now when that pelvis is rotated forward, we now see changes in how the moment arms, so how far these are away from this joint center of the hip itself, are now actually changing. So if we rotate that pelvis forward, so imagine it in your mind of that pelvis rotating forward, well, it actually changes some functioning of some key muscles. So for these muscles over here, the adductor muscles, number 3, 7, and 8, so hip flexors as well. When we also see the adductors and the hip flexors change in terms of being accentuated with this anterior pelvic tilt, we now see a change in the muscles that are happening as well and behind, because now these muscles become lengthened because of the pelvis rotating forward. And when we're running, for example, we now have a muscle that is compensating for a change in how much these muscles can produce hip extension. So in this case, the number 4 is that adductor magnus. So this basically small change that happens at the pelvis that rotates forward because of sitting all the time, changes these moment arms by accentuating these muscles. But now it also accentuates the adductor muscle, which is an extensor at some particular point in the stance phase of running, and now can become overused and therefore have adductor strains. So just from one small kinematic change of the pelvis changing, it really changes the entire dynamics of how muscles are crossing the joint and how they produce that motion at that joint. So here's a really good example as well, is that if we not only adapt the mechanical changes, we can now also change functional concepts. So for example, this is a landing from Darren Padua's presentation he made at some it's like a long time ago now, where if you just look at the change in how the trunk is positioned during land. So here's the trunk here, and here's the trunk in two different ways, right? One is a landing where the trunk is very vertical, but you have a nice knee flexion. So a lot of my experience with regards to young female athletes, particularly in the soccer world, is that I think they have been taught to flex their knees, make a soft landing. Well, at the very, I'm going to say around 13, up to 13 years old, or right around that time in particular, we see they do this type of task where the trunk is basically vertical throughout the entire landing, but the knee flexion is actually pretty large. So if you just visually look at how they landed, you would say, oh, that's a soft landing. But if you look at it a little carefully, the functional connection of how this large mass above the pelvis, which is the trunk, is positioned a certain distance away from that point of rotation, is that this would actually cause a very large joint moment at the knee. So the quadriceps would be a high demand with regard to shock absorber during landing. So if I say this once again, think about this ground reaction force happening at a center of pressure. So like a balancing point where all the forces are applied underneath the foot. And that direction or vector of that ground reaction force, how far that is away from the knees, that's what actually dictates that knee moment. So now if we go to a different type of landing style where we land and we still have the same amount of knee flexion, but now we also have some hip flexion, or in other words, the trunk is moving forward as well, rotating forward. And notice now how that line of action of that ground reaction force is much closer to the knee joint. So that change is now actually going to reduce how much the quadriceps are required to shock absorb during that landing. The one thing that we also kind of forget in this grand scheme of things are what are actually the hip extensors doing, and that includes the large gluteal muscles, but also the hamstrings. I noticed in this example where we have a large knee torque, but a low hip torque. And this one we have a low knee torque, but a large hip extensor torque. We would think that this type of style over here would be much more conducive to the knee joint with regards to safety and stress, because now the muscles that actually prevent that femur from rotating or translating forward is actually being prevented by the hamstrings and hip extensors. And this case over here, we basically have a very small contribution, but a very large moment at the knee, which causes that translation to potentially move forward. So now imagine some other type of external events happening at the same time. We have a small bump, we become off balance, and maybe potentially you actually have a nice collection of things happening that will actually be more relevant to stress on the knee joint. So in this case, even though that the trunk is not a muscle itself, it actually, the position of it, a functional position of it, will now actually influence the knee joint and the loading across that joint. All right. So we also can have the combination of the mechanical and functional connections occurring as we move as well. And this is one of my favorite projects that I did back at Stephen Hawkins in the, probably 20 years ago now. But this is a more recent paper by Noren et al. That looked at what are the walking styles of an individual after ACL reconstruction. So they have ACL reconstruction and they start to recover over some time. Now remember, the one thing as professionals that we're able to do is we're able to see how a person is moving. And that vision of what that person is doing is we're actually observing the kinematics or the motions that are occurring for that individual. So notice in the knee angles here, this sagittal plane knee angle, where we just normal walking, where we contact with about 10 degrees of flexion, and then we flex, extend, flex throughout walking. And then we compare the opposite side. So the injured side, in this case, or the recovering side, was actually the dashed line. And so we visually would see a pretty symmetrical type of motion. And I think that's one of the common denominators of whether we want to allow an individual return to sport is if we see some level of symmetry from right and left legs in terms of how they motion or how they produce some performance. So in this case, we have a kinematic equality between right and left legs. But if you notice here on the right, where we have the hip and knee moments, we see some really big changes. So this component over here, so this is, once again, is the ACL reconstructed leg, and this is the normal side, so the non-injured and the injured side. And notice that even though they have this normal walking pattern, symmetrical between right and left, the knee extensor moment, so basically how the quads are functioning, is actually lowered. At the same time, the hip extensor function is actually increased. So even though there is a normal motion happening, the kinetics, which are typically invisible to our eyes, are actually still adapted. So I think this is should be flagged in our own minds of trying, in our own minds of how each one of our professions can lead to some measurement that actually looks at the kinetics or the muscular forces that happen at the knee joint, and basically identifying what those forces are, or predicting what those forces are, and then seeing how those forces recover, then allow the individual return based on the kinetics and not necessarily the kinematics of just a symmetrical type of motion. So once again, we have normal kinematics in this case, but severely altered type of kinetics. So we basically would have a neuromuscular issue that's going to be happening, and how that could potentially translate to other parts of the body is to be determined. So this was the example what we just showed, is that if we look at just the skeleton view, and I just gave this a muscle as a vector of all the quads, and this would be the vector of all the hip extensors, and mainly the hamstrings in this case. And one of the papers I've read, and I'm sorry, I can't remember where I saw this. I'm going to try to find this at one point because I keep referencing this paper. But there was an example of an individual, and there's like 2 or 3 of them, with a particular abnormality or neuromuscular issue where the quadriceps were basically at 0 level of function. So the quadriceps were unable to actually produce force, but the individual was able to normally walk. And we asked that question, well, how can you walk without any force coming from the quadricep muscles? Well, if we think about that last example, where if your foot is on the ground, if your hamstrings and hip extensors actually rotate, produce force to rotate that femur backwards, in essence, you could extend the knee by using the hip extensors and hamstrings rather than any part of the quads at all. So here's now this concept of a mechanical issue or mechanical change, and then a functional change, and then now how that translates into a new pattern of a neuromuscular compensation for whatever potential issue or some other persisting type of issue that the individual may feel or subconsciously feel, could actually allow an individual to perform their normal movements, but now perform it with a way that looks normal, but now actually is produced with a very different way of muscles producing that motion itself at each joint. So this kind of leads us closer into the regional interdependence idea, where now we have coined in the literature, and there's several papers now. There's probably, I think if you look at the review by Newman and Dostal, we basically have at least 20 to 40 papers way back at the time of even 2010 that actually says, here's some mechanistic connections of how the hip is influencing other clinical issues at a different joint. So when you have a change of the hip, and this is more likely a change in the pelvis positioning of it, we can actually see changes in the spine, so low back pain, the posture of the spine, so more lordosis in this case, or flatter lordotic curve, but as well as influence of how the muscles below the hip joint are functioning as well. And in this case, I think a really important concept is that, and I think this is still ongoing with regards to some of the implications, is that as soon as we start having some changes in hip function, maybe hip abductor muscle function, or just changing the pelvis positioning, we're going to also can see some changes with regards to patellofemoral pain, IT band syndrome, and pain associated with that, the knee, as well as how the knee becomes loaded or overloaded over time, eventually leading to osteoarthritis. So we have a hip spine, hip knee, but we also now have one thing that I'm interested in is the knee spine. So it's really kind of the combination of all three joints that are, as you're going up the chain, and you're probably going to see the ankle as well. But if you look at from the knee to the hip to the spine, it's basically they have all these different trade-offs, in essence, where problems at one lead to problems with these other joints. And so some of my research with alpine skiing, what I did is I looked at, well, what is some low back pain type of scoring on the bottom, and looked at the KOOS and the WOMAC scores up at the top. So just some clinical scores to see what happens when individuals report that there's knee and low back pain that are concurrent. Well, notice that as the low back pain issues and disability becomes higher, the knee scores become lower. So basically we have this concurrent change in how much the knee is able to function at the same time as the low back functions. Of interest is that Murata, I think this is where this Murata is from. This thing is that notice that when we start having knee pain, even imagine like an older population, we also see some changes in how the individual's posture is. So we basically have a more of a flexion of the posture of the trunk, and that flexion now has that moment arm of that all this mass closer to the knee joint center during walking, so potentially lower pain, lower compressive forces. But now there's actually now changes that are happening in the lower back. So when you have concurrent low back pain with concurrent knee pain, that knee pain is actually accentuated, the self-perception of that pain at the knee is actually enhanced when you have pain at both the low back and the knee. So it's a pretty interesting concept where one joint is related to the issues at another joint. And that leads us, it leads us into the concept of regional interdependence, because this model now of how joints are related or different areas of the body are related is actually a part of a assessment and intervention concept in the clinical world. Of interest is that if you look on the right, this is a nice review paper where there's a ton of support suggesting that if you treat one particular joint, so let's say if you're able to treat and restore the function of the hip, you now would see clinical reductions of pain and issues related with the low back or the lumbar spine. And so if you look at just this list over here, is that if you treat the very first joint, you'll basically have shown, or this research review has shown that now you will see changes in the clinical function of the other or distant joint that seems unrelated to it, but is actually very related based on functional and mechanical connections. So this has been kind of my interest, and it kind of grew to this component now of orthopedics, where at the very late 90s, when I was up in Vail with the Stedman Hawkins group, is that a lot of the doctors had this very isolated view of if the hip is the problem, or you have pain at the hip, then that's the problem. If you have pain at the knee, then the knee is the problem. And then eventually we start to understand how we did this mechanical and functional connections at the hip influence the knee, and that knee actually would those compensations influence the recovery time. Then that made perfect sense to us now that this should be a concept that we all think about, whatever movement profession we're in, is that even though we may have pain or some dysfunction at some particular joint or some muscular concept, or I feel it here, or my ankle here, or my joint here or there, that we don't just treat that one particular area. We have to obviously treat that for pain and if there's any inflammation, etc. But we also need to know what are some influential factors that are related to it. So in essence, are we treating the symptoms, or are we treating the mechanism? So that's why I wanted to throw this idea out that of regional interdependence. It's not simply an idea of here's some way of treating it, but it's really kind of incorporates how the body works mechanically and functionally with regards to how issues at one area of the body are influential on issues and function at another part. And I wanted to talk about this now with regards to a concept we said, we even discussed in this forum, I think now 2 sessions ago, where we were talking about how when we train motion or we train movement or we want to retrain some type of movement or motion, one of the key factors that seems to be very useful in this training and retention of this, so the learning of how the motion you want to train for your athlete, is if we're able to enhance the central nervous system ability to detect what is happening potentially at an area of the body that neuromuscular sensing is changed. So in essence, if we're able to add some proprioceptive device or wearable concept to an area of your body, that we can now allow that device to enhance the sensory, the afferents going up to the central nervous system, and that now influences how the body selects, identifies, and now creates a new pattern of preferred movement. And these ideas is not limited to a particular wearable. It's not limited to a particular way of restoring motion, but that idea of how we can potentially add some sensory component to a movement training, and that movement training is either for performance or for safety and recovery as well, is that now we can think about all the things that we could be doing that could actually change or influence how that individual improves over time. So I think that's kind of the key of how we can modify how people move, but also not only move better or move well, but now move in a way that is kinetically important and kinetically restored, as well as the kinematics of being restored as well. And so I'll leave this meeting with one of the early videos I did down at the University of Denver, where we basically had this wearable device where we didn't have any, it's just a compressive tube around the leg at this time. And then this, we had them repeat the task with some buttresses in here that press down onto the muscles for a soccer player. And so I'll just show you the video. You may have seen this at some point. Okay, that didn't show very well. I'll try that again. All right, so now I'm going to go back. Boop. All right, so normal condition. Notice we have a lot of things happening, right? So the foot's pointing forward, huge valgus motion, but notice that the pelvis actually drops. So the obliquity and pelvis, the trunk is moving way forward and down with regards to their motion. And without any type of feedback, without any type of changes other than this one concept of having the buttresses right around the VMO and behind the leg and the hamstrings, we redid the test, and a big change happens. So this is kind of what inspired a lot of the wearable research that has been ongoing. But notice that the change wasn't just at the knee. So look at big change in valgus from pre to post. This is immediate effects. So it's like they didn't do any training. They didn't do anything in between these two things other than walk 20 feet and back. And notice that the pelvis is more level. The trunk is not forward and down compared to this other picture. But a lot of things have changed going from the knee, from the ankle to the knee to the hip to the pelvis up to the trunk. So this was just an example of what I wanted to show, that if we're able to not only change the strength of muscles and the range of motion of what those joints can go through, we also can change how well training can actually enhance an individual's movement while they're performing a particular task. In this case, this young lady, all we had here was just a change in a proprioceptive input of a pressuring on the skin and potentially the muscles. And that change actually induced a pretty unique chain of events going from the ankle all the way up to the trunk. So that concludes my talk for today. Thank you for listening, and please look for emails for our next presentation for We Dig Movement.